Ladies and gentlemen, we've got quite a few Kenneths here today. One of the actors who plays Kenneth Williams, who isn't here today, is David Benson. And the reason why David Benson isn't here is because he's performing one of his shows elsewhere. His dad's Army show, which if you haven't seen it yet, go and see it. It's absolutely wonderful. Him and Jack Lane together. So, what I'm going to show you now is something I found in my archive. I only found it about a year or so ago. I used to be in a different incarnation. I used to be a broadcast journalist, which actually is how I met Valerie in 1994, her kindness and helping me in that early part of my career. And I used to do political reporting for a cable channel in London, a news channel called Channel 1. And I used to do all the political stuff. But because of my love for this type of thing, they let me, and because of the fact if I put on an event at Pinewood with, say, Dirk Bogarde or Norman Wisdom, I got them exclusive access. The deal was I could do the odd entertainment piece, and also they would film the events, and we could keep the archive. So we've got footage of Dirk Bogarde at the events. We've got footage of the Carry On events that Valerie came to. We've got footage of all these events. And, of course, the 40th anniversary event, John Huff's got the footage for. But anyway, I digress. Channel 1, I think it must have been about 10 years. It must have been the 10th anniversary of Kenneth's passing, give or take. David Benson had done this one-man show for a while and was just about to go into the West End with it. They allowed me to do a piece. There's no graphics because I've only got the edited version of it. But I thought you might like to see. I apologise in advance for my hair and for my tie. It was 20 years ago. It was just a stage I was going through. But I did feel that David Benson, and most of us will know David and his great work with Kenneth's show all those years ago, it's appropriate that we show this piece. So before we do the Q&A, let's just see a couple of minute news piece from 20 years ago. It's funny what you find in the archive, isn't it? And old beta tapes as well. And I did all the interviews and a lot of the filming as well. Anyway, I just thought we should see that piece, and I will pass on everyone's good wishes to David, who is still doing the show. And it's interesting because, of course, he was doing the show over 20 years ago when he was in his 30s. Well, now he's nearer Kenneth's later age. It'd be interesting to see it again now. But as I've said, go and see the Dad's Army show. And if you haven't seen Jack Lane's show about Norman Wisdom, you've got 2 more cracks at that as well. And now, finally, the final session, we have another Q&A session. Valerie Leon. Nanette Newman.
Thank you.
That's okay. And Jackanory producer, Jeremy Swan. Valerie, while we're getting ourselves positioned, can I apologise for your very short introduction? Oh, it's very nice. Look at that. Yes, of course you can. Apologies, Valerie, for your very short introduction, because actually we only asked you yesterday to join the Q&A, and he'd already edited it all, you see. So I said I've asked Valerie to join him, and oh, have you? Right. He goes, okay. But I couldn't not, because you work with Kenneth.
Only in Carry On Up the Khyber, but I must just ask you whether you know, because you know so much, that in 1999, the British Film Institute held a poll for the 100 best British films ever made, and Carry On Up the Khyber was included, which was wonderful. But admittedly, it came in at number 99, but it was still included. I just wondered if you knew that.
I saw in '95 they did a screening of it at the Barbican, and I'd never seen it Carry on a big screen by then. And actually, when you see it, and Peter Rogers he came for the introduction. He didn't sit on the film. He never stayed in for any of the films, Peter. He never saw them. He counted the money, but he never saw them. And it was amazing seeing Carry On Up the Khyber on a big screen. And I would urge people who've only ever seen a Carry On a small screen, I think they're very cheap and cheerful, watch some of the big ones and watch it on a big screen. And actually, very, very impressive indeed. Thank you for that, Larry. Nanette, you had you seem to have quite a close relationship with it. Was it a love-hate relationship, or?
Oh, no, not love-hate at all, really love, because I found him fascinating, outrageous, sad. I think he truly, for me, fitted the description of one-off. You don't meet many people like Kenneth in your life, and I always found him fascinating to work with. I didn't work with him as much as, for instance, Lorraine or lots of people here. But when I did, it was a great pleasure, and I loved every minute. And he was so incredibly outrageous, rude, wicked, funny, endearing, and everything put into one amazing cocktail that I always felt very privileged to have known him.
You were doing a piece of live television there.
Yes, I'd forgotten that.
Was it difficult to do live TV with Kenneth?
Well, it was, yes. I did What's My Line
Yes.
with him, with David Jacob as the team master or whatever. And I sat next to him, and he would do the most awful things because you had to guess what the person did, what their job was. And he would sit next to me, and he'd write a note like that. And when the camera was on me, he'd say, "I've got a note for you, it's a bit of help for you." And I'd say, "Oh, thank you." And he'd say, read it." And it was so filthy. It was unbelievable. I'd go, oh, Kenneth, well, thank you, that is a great help. And now and he'd go, read it out. Wicked like that. But on those shows, we used to go back afterwards, after we'd filmed them in Manchester, and stay the night. And he'd always ask me to stay up late. And those were the times when I saw a very different Kenneth. On my own with him, having lots of coffee, I found him very sad.
We'll probably come to that a little bit later, the character, the person himself. Jeremy, you're a producer of Jack and Ori. I know you've written something you want to tell us about, and then I might ask you some questions.
Over 50 years ago, I was the director of Jack and Ori, which was a TV storytelling programme for children on the BBC. I was a child director. Anyway, the casting of the Jack and Ori presenter was a very pleasing dilemma. Actors clamoured with their agents for the job, which was right up their egomaniacal street. It was a doddle of a job. There was nothing to learn. The performers read their stories on auto-cue. But Kenneth Williams had to be heavily persuaded. Anna Hume, the producer, and I relied on my friendship with Siobhan McKenna, who was Joan to his Dauphin in Shaw's St. Joan in the West End. Anna had presented me with a book to adapt, The Land of Green Ginger by Noel Langley, a sort of sequel to Aladdin, first published in 1937. Curiously, The Land of Green Ginger is the name of a street in Hull. And if Mr. Langley knew that, the information was far-flung, because he was a South African who had lived in California. He'd been the screenwriter of The Wizard of Oz. And if the friends of Dorothy thought that was camp, by George, you should read The Land of Green Ginger. Kenneth Williams would be just right to tell the tale. An influencing factor was his hugely popular and outrageous performances on radios round the horn. The kids would love him. He arrived seething in my office to rehearse. "One thing," he declared, "I'm not going to wear the hat." He said, "Hattie Jakes has told me, when you appear in this program, you've got to wear a great big hat that lights up a neon with the word Jack and Ori on the top of your head for the whole show." I'm not wearing that hat. Anyway, the denial of Miss Jake's mischief got us to put him into a caftan, which we've just seen in that picture there, which was suitable for the Orientalism of the story. Of course, he was wonderful during the programme. He managed a roguish, knowing nuance with the audience. "And do you know what happens next?" he'd say to the camera. "Oh, yes, you do." And he displayed a plethora of spectacular impersonations for the book's characters, ranging from Edith Evans, Felix Ameler, John Gielgud, Ralph Richardson, to Jules and Sandy and Rambling Sid Rumpold. People said Kenneth could be very difficult. Not a bit of it. Maybe being on Jack and Ori, he hadn't got anybody to be difficult with, except me. And we got on very, very well. Matters were enormously helped by us falling in love with Jonathan Cohen, who played the keyboards for the show. But the wonderful thing about Kenneth was his own sense of humour. I mean, you heard that terrible cackling laugh all on the clips we've just seen. And I remember I was going to join him once. We used to go to a restaurant called the Osteria Lariana in Frith Street. He said, "It's absolutely fabulous. There's never anybody there." If you've ever eaten anything in the Osteria Lariana, you would have found out why. Anyway, I got there and I was a bit late, and he said, "You're very late." He was nosing into a gin and tonic. And I said, "Oh, I bumped into a friend." A friend? Yes, a friend. He was a stage manager on a very big production of Midsummer Night's Dream by Peter Brook. And he was the stage manager. He was telling me about the time he had. I said, "Oh, yes, really?" I said, "This isn't going too well." So I said, "He told me a very funny story." "Oh, did he?" "Oh, it's frightening, terrifying." So I said, "Yes, he told me the story that when he was the stage manager, he was going around calling the half, and Robert Helpman was playing Oberon. And he knocked, and because of his status, Robert Helpman was given the umpire's dressing room. So he knocked on the door of the umpire's dressing room where Helpman was, and he was calling the half, the quarter of an hour, and he knocked on the door, "Quarter of an hour, please." And he got from inside, and he went in, and there was Robert Helpman, dressed as a dragonfly, standing on a bentwood chair under a naked bulb with a mirror in one hand and a great wad of blue goo in the other, which he was smearing over his right eye. And my friend said to him, "Are you all right up there, Bobby?" He said, "Yes, I'm fine, dear, but God knows how these umpires manage." Well, I told the story, and there was a silence. There was a terrible, I said, "Oh, God, this is not good." And then, and you've all heard it, this terrible, and he thought it was the funniest story he ever heard. He loved it. But anyway, that was his own sense of humor. And he was very nice whenever he told that. He did tell the story on television a few times. And he always credited Jeremy Swan heard this from a friend, which was part of his generosity. Anyway, thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you. I can feel another one-man show coming along, Jeremy. We shall have words afterwards. Valerie, going back to the Carry-Ons, as I said, he was more than the Carry-Ons, but that was an important part of his appeal and also his work for 20 years. What was it like, the atmosphere amongst the cast on the films that you were in?
Well, the atmosphere was, for the main characters, like returning to school, because 2 films were filmed every year. But Kenny was a terrible practical joker. And he used to wind up Charlie Hawtrey enormously, because every day Charlie would come to the studios carrying a plastic bag, and in it would be his Woodbine cigarettes, a bottle of Coke or Tizer, a newspaper, and his sandwich. And most days, Kenny would hide this bag, and so when poor Charlie was ready to sit down, relax, have a break, and enjoy his sandwich, do his crossword, the bag would be gone. There'd be terrible upsets and rows carrying on, and it would get so bad the assistant director used to have to be called to calm things down. But, you know, he was a joker. I think, on the whole, maybe they got on. Did you know, though, that he did make a proposal of marriage to someone? And do you... No. He made a proposal of marriage to Joan Sims. Yes, of course. And Joan said, "What's in it for me?" And he said, "Well, we'll throw wonderful parties." But that wasn't enough for poor Joan, which was a shame. Yeah. But you know, just one... No, nothing to do with the Carry-On.
She said, "I can't remember anything," she said to me. No. Which came and said, "Don't ask me anything."
No.
Carry on.
No, but in Hancock's Half Hour, you know that pilot sketch you mentioned?
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned, yes. The control tower girl in that sketch, Hattie Jakes. Did you know that? It was Hattie Jakes. Yeah, it was Hattie Jakes in that control. I mean, and in fact, in Hancock's, Hattie and Sid James and Kenny, I mean, a lot of the Carry-Ons, the team worked for Hancock's Half Hour. All right?
It was worth mentioning, thank you. It was worth mentioning because people say to me, "Oh, why is this event being held at Elstree?" It could be held anywhere, to be honest with you. Did Kenneth ever work at Elstree? And I've got a list here of he did work at Elstree, and Adam compiled it, so it must be true. He did Valley of Song here in 1953, Innocence in Paris. Did that have Alistair Sim in it? Was that Alistair Sim? It wasn't Audrey Hepburn, was it? Now I'm thinking of something else. That was close. And Tommy the Toreador, was that with Tommy Steele? Was that written by Norman Hudis? Norman Hudis, who wrote the first 6 Carry-Ons, then went to America, did Marcus Welby and all those other types of things. He died. He was 93. Died a couple of years ago, by just nothing to do with this at all. But tomorrow I'm going down to Bournemouth to see his widow, who's moved back from America. She's in her late 80s, and I said I'd go and see her. And then he did a film called His and Hers, which, if I remember rightly, was Terry Thomas and Jeanette Scott. So he's done that. And he did something in TV here called called Dick and the Duchess. I don't know which part he played, though. We'll move swiftly back. Well, it was 1957, which by my calculation is just before 8 o'clock. No, but we'll move back to Nanette. Nanette, I don't want to get too much into the sadness of him, because I think that is well documented. And today we want to celebrate with laughter and with love. But I do think that there's a tortured side to a lot of people that bring us joy. That I think we talk about these things more now than we used to, and mental health and stuff. And I just wondered, sometimes I look at Peter Sellers and I look at Hancock and I look at Kenneth Williams, and I just wish perhaps if they lived in a different era, we could have done more to help them.
I'm sure, and I think in those days it was very much hidden. And it's interesting you say Tony Hancock, Peter Sellers, and Kenneth. I think they all had a kind of underlying sadness when they weren't performing. That was their sort of outward crust, and then when they were on their own, you probably saw that. I think they were very sad people. No, he didn't. I basically, on these occasions when I did find him very movingly sad, he would talk about his mother, about the problems he had with his family, and he would talk about lots of problems, and that's when he wasn't performing. And that's what I mean by being rather sad, you know. It was just the real Kenneth coming out.
And so let's end on a happy memory from you.
Okay.
He worked, was it something called Who's Baby?
Yes.
My goodness me.
Oh, that. I'd forgotten that.
It's a quiz. Is it a quiz show? I mean, he certainly got about a bit.
And you had to guess whose baby it was. And again, I sat next to him, and he would go, "The child's hideous." And then he used to really come into his own when we travelled up to Manchester to do the television shows, because we would all travel up together and we all hoped that we would get an empty carriage. And one day we got into the carriage and there was a rather starchy man sitting in the corner reading the Times, and Kenneth gets in and suddenly goes on a roll, and he slaps it down, the Times, and he says, "You won't need that, I'm going to be brilliant." And this man went, what? And for the whole of the journey, he was totally, utterly brilliant, filthy, outrageous, whatever you want to see. And this man nearly had a heart attack. And when the man got out, Kenneth shook his hand and said, "Wonderful to meet you. I hope we travel again soon." And I think this man went home and went to bed for the day.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to make sure that we ended our Q&A on a very happy note, and we couldn't have ended on a much happier one than that. This outrageous man that actually brought a lot of joy to people when he was just performing. Valerie, it's always delightful to see you, and we're particularly always happy to have Nanette here, because as well as her connections with Kenneth, her late husband, Brian Forbes, as you know, was managing director of these studios back in the late 60s and early 70s. Some wonderful films created at the time. Some of you were in Raging Moon, The Railway Children, and I have the blessing on Tuesday night to go to the University of Hertfordshire, where they're showing The Railway Children, and Sally Tomset is going to be a guest of Q&A. If you want tickets, go on the site, you can still see them. But these films are still much loved. Brian was very kind to me when I was writing some books 10, 15 years ago. A much loved man in the industry, as you are a much loved woman in the industry. So it's a double honour to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Swan, Valerie Leon, and Nanette Newman.